Some of those.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order. This is the work session on AO 2019-51 regarding cell phone usage. Let's go ahead and do introductions, starting with Mr. Constant.
Mr. Constant.
Pete Peterson.
Meg Valito.
Austin Quinn Davidson.
Forrest Dunbar.
John Weddleton.
Felix Rivera. So under advice of her counsel at work, Suzanne LaFrance will not be attending this work session. And then Mr. Perez-Verdia is not in the room right now, but he will be joining us shortly. Before we get to the topic at hand, I just want to, as I had committed, have all of the committee assignments and chairs. I just want to speak to that briefly on the record regarding my decisions and some of the thought process. So I built these changes with several ideas in mind. So first was the opportunities for new members to take on leadership roles. This is an opportunity that I had, and it provided me with, I think, a very different perspective as a new member when, right after I was sworn in, I became the chair of the Assembly Committee on Homelessness, one of our more controversial committees. So that was one of the thoughts and ideas that I had. Second, regarding effectiveness and collaboration. Something that I spoke about on Tuesday at the Assembly meeting, something that I really want us to hone in on, how we can be as effective as possible. Our top 5 committees take on a tremendous amount of work from time to time. A collaborative approach to these committees, which those 5 I believe to be public safety, homelessness, community and economic development, budget and finance, and enterprise and utility oversight, will help the Assembly as a whole respond to the community and guide the policy of the city. Now, I have the full faith and confidence that we could continue to run these committees as sole chair committees, and the work would get done. This is my effort to try a new structure and increase our collaborative efforts. I'm confident that we could build up our vision as an Assembly under this paradigm. Last, as the first openly LGBT and Latino chair, and maybe youngest, I'm not sure, I am very attuned to the issues of gender and diversity. So it was another guiding factor in my decision-making process. So although I was elected in this leadership role and could have made these decisions on my own without any explanation, I just wanted to spend a few minutes explaining my thinking and being transparent to the members. Within the limits of the Open Meetings Act, I'm open to discussing these changes further with members. With that, we're going to go ahead and now we have 25 minutes to talk about cell phones. So I think we have Deputy Chief McCoy here to talk.
Yes.
All right, go ahead.
So I reviewed the proposal, and from the police department standpoint, we don't have any concerns. We will always welcome a new tool into our arsenal to address public safety, and specifically in dealing with safety in school zones, where we're always in favor of additional tools to assist. With that being said, we're comfortable with the tools that we already have. We feel we've been able to effectively handle any instances in school zones as it already has occurred. But like I said, we'll take on additional tools, and I'm going to answer any specific questions you may have, but we don't have any concerns about the ordinance.
Okay, thank you. So, sure. Looks like we have a queue. Ms. Salvatore.
Thank you, through the chair. What is the current enforcement of traffic in school zones? I read in the information that there wouldn't be any additional enforcement. So can you give me kind of lay of the current plan?
Right. So yes, this wouldn't bring on any additional enforcement. So right now, our traffic unit does enforcement in school zones as operationally needed. The school resource officers, their duties vary from school to school. So if there's a problem at a particular school, school resource officer may get out and do some traffic enforcement, but it's really depending upon what's going on at that school. So this year we've issued around 50 citations in school zones for operating with a screen device open, and that's with the existing ordinance already that we've been able to use. And like I said, we have tools to deal with a person who may be using a cell phone who's involved in a collision. We have careless driving, we have reckless driving statutes. So we are able to effectively address those circumstances. However, when we're doing this ordinance, this would be a more refined tool for us to use. So, for instance, we wouldn't have to wait for a collision to charge someone with reckless or careless driving for using a cell phone. If we see someone using that in the school zone, we can take proactive measures and issue a citation for that. But back to your question, we're not going to see any additional traffic enforcement efforts. This will be incorporated into what we're already doing with our traffic units and our SROs dealing with specific problems at individual schools.
May I have one follow-up?
Sure.
You'd mentioned you already have the tool of ticketing someone for driving with a screen device. This adds an additional offense with a fine amount of $500 for driving while using a cell phone in a school zone. Is that like a double whammy if your screen device is also your cell phone? Like, can you flesh that out a little bit?
So I don't see a circumstance where we would cite both. It would be one or the other. So right now, utilizing a screen device, the person has to have that in full view and not be utilizing it as a voice communication device, more of a visual. So the new ordinance is more refined to where it's specifically addressing utilizing that device for voice operation, which would have to be hands-free in this particular circumstance.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Alto. Before I get to you, Mr. Weddleton, we've been joined by Mr. Dyson and Mr. Gates. Go ahead, Mr. Weddleton. Oh, yeah, I introduced him at the beginning, but we've been officially joined by Mr. Presbyterian.
So I'm a sponsor of this with Eric Croft, who bailed. And I thought it's unique that we should all call into this meeting, but didn't do that.
Speakerphone.
But I appreciate Meg's questions because those are really some key issues on this. You know, my interest on this is I had just the absolute pleasure of being able to walk my kids to elementary school every single year. It was amazing. It's half a mile down the hill from Joe Valley Elementary. And, you know, we had weather, we had moose, we had bear once. And never ever felt threatened until I hit the crosswalk in front of the school. People simply didn't care. They didn't pay attention. You've seen it. You know, coffee, sandwich, cell phone, driving like this in the school zone right through the crosswalk because we would be in it. It was ridiculous, you know. And I became known as the irate crosswalk guy in the class. And that was they're in their 20s now. So this is a lot of years ago. We have a lot more self-focus now. But I have questions on the enforcement. So we're not going to have more, but. I mean, there is a question, there won't be enforcement, why even do this? You know, is it helpful to have a law in the books, even if it's not enforced?
Well, yes, and there will be enforcement. As I mentioned, we've already issued 50 citations this year alone for school zone violations involving a screen device. So there will be enforcement. And I do think there's benefit from having an ordinance. Just from the public awareness standpoint, the public will know that now it's illegal to utilize that cell phone within a school zone. So you're going to gain compliance just from awareness. And then, again, this is just another tool for us to utilize in combination with all of our enforcement efforts. So it's not something that will be ignored, and there will be, enforcement. However, from our operational standpoint, we're probably not going to be able to do additional enforcement than what we're already doing.
Right. I understand that.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions. So I guess one gets to that public awareness piece. So what would we do if we were to vote for this? Do we just suddenly ticket a few people, or how do we get out the word? And maybe, John, you have ideas about that too. So that's one thing. And then if we recognize the dangers of people driving while holding their phone, why not do it everywhere?
Go ahead, Mr. Weddleton.
Great questions. We actually had this almost written up probably 4 months ago. So I've been shopping around and going to PTAs in South Anchorage, and community council, the most common question is, why only school zones? Why not everywhere? So there is no question we drive poorly when we're on our cell phones, no matter where we are. This is a baby step, and it responds partly because the state changed the law, so we could do this in school zones.
Only in school zone.
Right. So we're just focusing on that. Getting word out is PTAs will do it.
Okay.
And I'll tell you, I go to a lot of community council meetings. When I go to PTAs, they get the job done. Go to PTA meeting, they are fast and efficient. They get word out. They don't have tasks. So I think word will get out quickly on this. It's already out for the PTAs in my district.
So, can I just do follow-ups? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, great. I was just going to add on the police department, we would put that information out also. We're going to start enforcing that. We would send out nixels and use our social media platform to inform the public that there has been a new ordinance and expect to see some police enforcement.
Can I just
Sure.
because these are school zones are not just like PTA is parents and they're inside the school thing, but this is like me driving past Turnigan Elementary. I'm not a parent, so I'm going to drive past there in the morning and not need to be on the phone. So I think it's important we have these extra ways to reach people. Thanks.
Those lights behind
Yeah.
shine. Maybe I
Then I'll
can pull
know.
over there.
Yeah, I won't even notice because I'll be on my phone.
Thank you, Ms. Cook-Davidson. So I have Mr. Dunbar, Mr. Dyson, Mr. Peterson, and Mr. Gates.
Yeah, so a couple of questions here. What does it mean to use a cell phone, right? So to use a mobile communications device while driving a vehicle in active school zone. So people do a lot more than just talk on their phone. They listen to music, they listen to podcasts, that kind of thing. Is the interpretation here they have to turn those things off before they went through a school zone?
No, my interpretation is as long as it's hands-free, it can be utilized. While you're in the school zone, you're not allowed to activate or deactivate a feature. But if it's already playing music or you already are having a conversation with it on hands-free when you're driving through the zone, that's fine. The problem comes in when you actually manipulate the phone physically, so you wouldn't be able to activate or deactivate whatever app that you're utilizing while driving through the school zone.
Okay. So my other question has to do with section 2. And I apologize, I didn't hear the very first part of your presentation, Chief McCoy. I was still absorbing our liaison assignments. Not more than 1 year and a $10,000 fine, so these are misdemeanor offenses, right? So at what point would me, like, let's say somebody calls and I answer and then I realize, oh, I happen to be driving past a school at that point, and so I was in the school zone, like, on Minnesota, for example. Does this mean I could go to jail for a year? That's only if you get in a wreck?
Right, so if we charge a criminal offense such as reckless driving, yes. My understanding is this would just be an infraction with a $500 fine.
Well, I guess I need to learn more about how Section 2, and this is a question for you, Dean, if these are like aggravators or if these are standalone offenses that are included in a charging document. How does this work exactly?
You have 2 levels. And then wait.
Sure, Mr. Gates, or you can.
If Dean wants to answer, that's fine, or I can.
I'm not clear on the question. It's how you charge in 948.
So
then maybe you should answer.
okay, so if you
I think I understand what he's addressing. If all you're doing is talking on your phone when you're not supposed to, it's an infraction with a $500 fine.
Yep.
If you get in an accident, as it says under E2, and there's physical injury or death while you're yakking on your phone and driving, then it could be charged as a criminal misdemeanor. But
Gotcha.
in referring to what Ken was saying, it could also fall into careless driving or reckless driving at that point. And I think the prosecutor would probably just pick which misdemeanor offense we're going to go with.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? Can careless driving or reckless driving be charged without there being a crash or serious physical injury?
Could be, and I would distinguish those two require some kind of bad driving as a element of the crime, whereas this one, in some ways, is kind of like DWI. Some people drive under the influence and they have 0 traffic infractions. So that the part of this that's just the infraction is saying, this is society and the assembly saying just driving with a cell phone and using it in other than hands-free is, potentially dangerous, just like driving under the influence is potentially dangerous.
Can I ask a follow-up thing? Sure. Well, I think we do that with the citation. What you've just said is you can be charged with, if you were driving in a reckless or careless way, you can be charged with these criminal offenses. So why include this at all, right? Because what you've done here, unless I'm misinterpreting it, even if you aren't driving in a careless or obviously reckless way, but you're on your phone, then under this statute, even without a crash, you could be subject to a misdemeanor offense, criminal offense.
No. Only the infraction under E1.
Okay.
If all you're doing is driving improperly with a cell phone, so to speak, you're just driving down the road through the school zone or on school grounds, and you've got one hand on the wheel and one hand on the phone, that is an infraction.
But I guess I still don't understand then what additional utility do we get by adding this to the criminal code as opposed to the traffic code?
From a police standpoint, a police investigative standpoint, it would be a lot easier to gather evidence of that. So, for instance, if you were driving on your cell phone and you were involved in a collision, and I wanted to charge careless or reckless driving, I would have to show that your driving was careless or reckless to bring that misdemeanor charge forward. However, if I wanted to charge under this, the mere fact that you were on your phone when you were involved in the collision meets the elements of this. A lot easier burden to prove from an investigative standpoint.
I want to go to Mr. Gates, see if he has something to add.
Oh, thank you. And I concur with what Mr. Shu and the Deputy Chief said. And as the draft code is explaining, coming out with these different penalty levels and some things, I have seen some other laws, criminal laws in our state statutes in Title 11 that have significant, infraction level. Like if there's a serious injury or death, then it rises to misdemeanor level offense. So I think that clearly you can state there's that. I think that was good. And then a second thing related to Mr. Dunbar's question. This is in the traffic code in Title 9 because it fits in with other misdemeanor criminal offenses that are also in traffic code because they're related to driving, DUI, and all these codes in our traffic code as well. So the Deputy Chief's explanation is perfect for the practical sense. And I think from both the code organizations and some cases as well.
Okay. All right, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. And quickly before I move on, Mr. Dunbar, you noted liaisons. That is something that will be updated next week. So you're correct that these are the old liaisons. Okay, Mr. Dyson, then Mr. Peterson, then Mr. Perez-Verdier.
Yeah. So under the affirmative defenses, to me, it doesn't make sense to have a health clinic and a medical doctor's thing. None of the school district or zones I know are more than 2 blocks long. Somebody ought to be able to wait till you get to the end of that 2 blocks to call about a doctor's appointment. Mr. McCoy, Chief McCoy, I hope you're not all dressed up because you got a job interview. I am probably the head of your fan club. If somebody contests this thing, can you get their phone records to confirm that they were?
Yes, Mr. Dyson, thank you for that question. So the exceptions, would be somewhat of a challenge for us. So if someone told us they were on their phone with their doctor in the school zone, that's an affirmative defense. So for us to get those records, we would need a search warrant, and realistically, for a routine traffic stop, those are additional measures that you're not going to find patrol officers typically taking. It would take them out of service for hours to do an investigation for a mere traffic violation. So I can tell you some of these exceptions will be a challenge for us.
So he can get the phone records to confirm somebody was using their phone. That's a separate but related subject. I don't think the doctor's appointment exception ought to, and medical clinic ought to be there, but it's a minor issue.
So Mr. Weddleton will address that in a minute. I have Mr. Peterson and Mr. Perez-Verdia.
Senator Dyson asked the question that I had, so.
Okay, great. Great minds think alike. Mr. Perez-Verdia.
Yeah, I'm not sure who to ask this question to, but there was a couple of things that were confusing on this to me. On page 1 at the bottom, it says driving while using a handheld cellular device or mobile communication device in school zones. But just below it says active school zones or upon property. So just clarifying school zones versus active school zones. And then the other part of the question is the definition of a school zone, and that it's during school operating hours. So not talking about when the lights are flashing, but anytime the school is in operation, or if there's somebody visibly present in the school zone. Seems difficult to define. Can you maybe explain that to me and how we would know whether it's active or not? And so I think you get the question.
Yeah. So I think Mr. Gates wanted to respond.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, Mr. Perez-Verdia. You raised my hand earlier to talk to exactly to what that school zone means. And we have a definition in page 2 for active school zone in line 29. And I don't think that really answers your question. It refers though to another definition in 914, and this is in Title 9 in our code, which applies to all use of these terms in Title 9, which is where this lead on. So the definition of school zone there says it means that territory for school zone, that territory including streets adjacent to a public or private school or school grounds or any other area so designated by the traffic engineer. And I had a conversation with traffic engineer a while back. If I remember right, they haven't really designated school zones, but this is clear that the streets right next to the school property are part of this active school zone definition. And that this definition says any other times persons are visibly present. I guess you could have a situation where it's 10 p.m. and people are present on the other side of the school and around the side of the cover. So I think that kind of instance will be rare and that a police going to be present to catch that offense. I mean, every crime probably has some situation that's rare that it might be confusion, but I don't think that should not safety purposes.
Can I ask just one other follow-up? So the intention is that it's when the school is actively being used, that's what we mean by an active school zone, as opposed to non-active school zone when school is not actively being used. Is that the
part of this is how it's being enforced after school hours and when kids are all playing on the playground like they do it at 5 or 6. But I would defer for some issues probably.
And I don't know if I ever identified myself. Todd Sherwood, Assistant Municipal Attorney. Couple things, because you had mentioned first, and I don't know if this is part of your question, you noted that the title said school zones and the body and the definition said active school zone. There's a principle, it comes out in case law that what is in a title is not part of the law. So you properly identified that there is a difference, and that could be cleaned up to make it look nicer through an amendment, but the law is what's under the title. The other thing to note is within the law, and I think, no, the title doesn't say that, but this applies both to active school zone, and I defer to Dean on this, but we're talking there about the roadway, the public highway, so to speak, but also or upon school property. So that's when they drive in and they're hanging out in the parking lot. My read of this is because those two are distinguished, that in the summer, if somebody drives in there, and of course kids often are at playgrounds and on school grounds when school is closed, they still fall under the protection of the ordinance. At that time, even though the school zone out in the public highway, the lights are not flashing and no children are walking through. I think it could easily be read that way.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Verdillo. All right, so we have 2 minutes left. I have 3 people in the queue. Weddleton, Dunbar, and Dyson. Go ahead, Mr. Weddleton.
I'll be quick. One thing is not every school zone has flashing lights. Some are just not. Mr. McCoy, on B with the exceptions, which ones cause you the biggest problem?
Well, to be honest with you, all of them would be a challenge. And only, in a major case, no problem. We're doing a full investigation. We're getting search warrants, especially in situations where people are injured. But in just a routine traffic situation, if we're going to cite someone for utilizing their cell phone in the zone, their excuse to it is, well, I was on the phone with my doctor's office, and we can't compel them to prove that to us by showing us their phones. So if we wanted to properly investigate that, we would have to either seize their phone and go get a search warrant, or detain them while we get a search warrant. And those are just aren't reasonable acts that a patrol officer is going to do for a routine traffic stop. For a collision, yes, we'll do a lot more in-depth of an investigation. But I just think there's a lot of room for challenging and abusing the system with that many exceptions.
So if it were narrowed down to fire department and police department, that would be easy for you to
It would be
check.
easy for us to verify because, yes, we have those calls coming into our call center. And my recommendation would be, if it's an emergency and they're on the phone, typically if it's an emergency, you're calling 911, and we would be able to track that very easily.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you. Is this up for a public hearing on Tuesday? Okay, so I'm going to probably ask to delay this a little bit because I think there's still some work that needs to be done here.
I agree.
And 1.5 hour work session is not enough to alter the criminal code. For me, I think Cameron, Mr. Perez gave me a really good point about when it's active and when it's not. And I don't think the issue is actually when there are kids in the building or when there aren't kids in the building. It's a notice issue. It's a notice for people when they are subject to this criminal penalty or not. So the ones that are signed that say this is always a school zone, good. I think a blanket on school property, fine. If it's clear that you're on school property and not on something the school owns, like the big chunk of land out in East Anchorage and Totem Theater, right? But you're actually on a real school property. The flashing lights, I think, actually are important. More important than whether or not someone is actually at that school in West. Because, like you said, it's impossible for the public that is subject to this criminal law to know if someone's in that building or not, and that flashing light does important work. So I think there's definitional work that needs to be done on the active school zone. I think there's also definitional work that needs to be done on the word use, which we had a conversation about. And your interpretation, I think, is the correct one and I appreciate it, but I think it needs to be more explicit here, because my experience is both the equivalent of a prosecutor and the equivalent of a defense attorney is that a prosecutor they'll be creative with their charging. And unless you are very specific, they will not necessarily take the interpretation that you did, Chief McCoy. And so I want to be very clear on the definitions.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Dyson.
Mr. Middleton, did you intentionally omit mobile radios?
I did not give it a moment's thought.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. All right. Just note for the record, we've been joined by Ms. Kennedy at the very end of the work session. Then I assume we'll have the discussion at the meeting. If we postpone, I will have another work session so we can continue this discussion. All right, I'll close this one.